Hey guys, good afternoon. Welcome back. Thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to get into Little Feat and Lowell George, the creative songwriter and monster slide guitarist. I was originally turned on to Little Feat by a drummer that I worked with a number of years ago, and I confess I had not heard of them, and I should have. Years before Tom ever said anything to me about him, because I remember listening after he turned me on to him, listening to "Waiting for Columbus," their live record, and just wondering how the hell did I miss this? But I'm not going to get into Little Feat sans George, guys, and that's no disrespect to the remaining musicians. Let It Roll, their 1988 comeback record that obviously didn't involve George because he was dead. But I was a fan of that record. I really enjoyed that record, but it wasn't Little Feat to me. It almost sounded like a new band compared to the first two records with the Warner Brothers, and Dixie Chicken and Feats Don't Fail Me Now. So without that George stamp, it just doesn't seem productive to even get into it. So Lowell Thomas George, born April 13th, 1945 in Hollywood. So the origin of Feat is Los Angeles, California. He was born to a chinchilla farmer who supplied furs to movie studios. So that's interesting, but we're talking about California here. After graduation, he worked as a gas station attendant, and it was the experiences as a gas station attendant that were said to be the inspiration for the later penned song "Willin'," which obviously became a Feat flagship song. And Lowell was a guitar player in Zappa's Mother's Invention. Briefly, now there are conflicting stories on why Lowell left or was dismissed. There's three of them, to be exact, three stories. So people in the know, much more in the know than I am, can't agree on what happened. So we're going to skip all that. There's no point in getting into that. That's still being argued. But one thing that is clear by all accounts is that Zappa helped Lowell George get secure his deal with Warner Brothers. So the relationship couldn't have been too frosty, if Zappa was willing to pick up the phone, make that call, and get that deal carved out, or get the plate warmed, at least for Lowell's partnership with the monster Warner Brothers Records. Let's get into the first incarnation of the band after they secured their deal with WB. Of course, you had Lowell Thomas George. Roy Estrada was playing bass for him. Estrada, interestingly enough, he met in Mothers. So Estrada was the bass player for Zappa and Mothers of Invention. Came over with George. Keyboard player, monster Billy Payne, and drummer Richie Hayward. So what puzzles me is this incarnation of the band isn't referenced as the classic lineup. The classic lineup is referenced as everything Dixie Chicken and Forward, which is a little puzzling to me, because I really found those two records to be pure George, pure. I mean, don't get me wrong. Dixie Chicken was, it's a great record, but those first two ones, I'm like, well, that's as classic to me. That four-piece lineup in '69 when they first got their deal, that's as classic to me as the additions of the other musicians that comprised the group that went in to do Dixie Chicken. So I guess it's depends on who you What stands out to me on both those records, the the 69 Little Feat debut, and Sailing Shoes, is you'll find Willin twice. Both records have Willin. And I looked into that a little bit. What happened was when they recorded the 69 on the debut, the 69 version of Willin, George had injured his hand with a model airplane. Just like California again. So George had injured his hand on a model airplane, and they had to bring in Ry Cooder. And so Ry Cooder is the slide dude on Willin in the 69 version of Willin on the debut record. But when they did Sailing Shoes, they re-recorded it for George to play the slide work. And that makes sense. I mean, you have a monster slide guy that wrote a great song. You know, he's going to want to play slide on his tune, and I get that, but I thought that was that's an interesting little sidebar there, that and that you're in pretty good company as a slide guy when you can bring in Ry Cooder to play the slide parts because you hurt your hand on a model airplane. But yeah, they call it the entertainment business for a reason, I guess. So the first record delivered to Warner Brothers was recorded mostly in August and September of 1970 and released in January of 1971. Number 2 came along, Sailing Shoes, in 72. The interesting thing about the 72 record, Ted Templeman produced that record. So a heavy Warner Brothers guy, but the connection, he did all Van Halen stuff. And what I thought was interesting is years later, when I was watching Live Without a Net as a teenager, when Sammy had first joined Van Halen, they shout out, "Hey, we want to do a song by a friend of ours." And they did Apolitical Blues, which is, I didn't know who that was. I had no idea what they were talking about. As I had said earlier, I hadn't heard of Little Feat, certainly by that age. And so I realized then, oh, okay, well, you know, here, Hollywood, you know, George is a Hollywood dude, born in L.A., Van Halen from California, Warner Brothers deal, Ted Templeman. Templeman does all of Van Halen's stuff and was the producer on the second record, and also did number 6. So Templeman produced Sailing Shoes, and he also produced Time Loves a Hero. So I'm always fascinated by those little connections that, you know, when you dig into the history of these musicians and record company people, A&R people, producers, you start to see these connections and these common threads, and sometimes they surprise you. You know, what does Little Feat have to do with Van Halen and vice versa? So, yeah, again, another interesting sidebar. Now, the first 2 records were warmly received by critics and received critical acclaim. But despite the good reviews of Sailing Shoes, the lack of commercial success led to the split up of the band. Estrada jetted, and in 1972, Lowell had to go back to the drawing board and revamp the lineup. Which brings us to what's considered or referenced as their classic lineup, I guess based on Dixie Chicken being their primary opus. So the classic lineup was in place by 1972. Lowell, George, of course, Billy Payne remained on keys. You can't imagine Little Feat without him. Richie Hayward, drums. Kenny Gradney was the new bass player for the departed Estrada. They brought on Paul Barrier, guitar vocals, and their percussionist was Sam Clayton. And this is the consortium that headed into the studio for the classic Dixie Chicken, their third effort. This new lineup definitely instilled a New Orleans funk vibe, a very radically altered lineup. They went to 6-piece, they were 4, so there's a difference in those two records. You listen to them, then comes along Dixie, but it's still feet, it's still George is the primary guy, he's still there. So they went on to record Dixie Chicken, released in 1973, obviously one of the band's most popular albums. There was another interesting fusion of musicians that came together. I'm a big fan of Robert Palmer, and again, another one of those deals where, well, what does Robert Palmer have to do with Little Feat? But in 1974, Lowell, along with the Meters and other session musicians, they were the band that backed up Palmer on his Island Records debut, Sneakin' Sally Through the Alley, which is a great record. But if you look on that, if you're a Robert Palmer fan and you have that album, you'll see Palmer does Sailing Shoes. So it's really cool when you see, you hear Palmer, Simply Irresistible. You can't imagine that guy when he went on with his 80s new wave and his top 40 shtick. But if you go back to Sneakin' Sally Through the Alley, you can hear Little Feat in that whole production. And you should, because it's Lowell, George, and the Meters and other Little Feat guys that weren't even credited on that Island Records debut for Palmer, Sneakin' Sally Through the Alley, which, like I said, is a great record. If you're a Little Feat fan, you should check that out, because it's Little Feat with a hell of a vocalist in Robert Palmer. On a personal note, Lowell had a appetite for heroin, speedballing, cocaine, alcohol, the whole 9 yards. No judgment. I'm just sharing information with you. So in 1975, he entered treatment for heroin. All the surviving members of Little Feat, the Dixie Chicken classic lineup dudes, have been very open and have gone on the record of how difficult it was to work with George from the mid-70s on. And if you've ever worked with a drunk or a drug addict, there's a lot of cake and ice cream. there's a lot of cake and ice cream that comes along with dealing with someone like that. And Lowell's, of course, a monster talent, great songwriter, and all that. But you can imagine trying to deal with this guy in the studio and otherwise at shows. These guys are probably thinking at some point, how many shit sandwiches am I willing to eat here? But he tried to get himself cleaned up in 75, which brings us to August 1977. Little Feat recorded a live album, which would go on to be Waiting for Columbus, from gigs at the Rainbow Theatre in London and the Lisner Auditorium in Washington. So everything you hear on those records was recorded from those gigs in London and in Washington, D.C. And as all of you know, if you're listening to this, is considered and should be considered to be one of the greatest live records of all time. And another side note on a great record, Waiting on Columbus. And I'm not trying to take anything away from the record, because I love it. I absolutely love it. But one sidebar on that is a significant portion of George's vocal and slide work were overdubbed later on in the studio. So it's live, but it kind of isn't all live. But that was released in 1978, by which time George's interest in the band was waning, and his health was on the decline for sure. And then the sad, inevitable end, like we often see with heroin. George died June 29th, 1979 at 34 years old. Can you believe that? June 29th, the morning after an appearance at Washington, D.C.'s Lisner Auditorium, where a balk of Waiting for Columbus had been recorded, as I'd said earlier. He collapsed and died of a heart attack in his Arlington, Virginia hotel room at the Twin Bridges Marriott. So there you have it. Warner Brothers artist, phenomenal slide player, creative songwriter, takes a dive at the Marriott. Thanks, heroin. The autopsy showed that George had died from an accidental overdose. But, this is always the case, guys. People who want history to remember these guys kindly, well, they'll stick to the heart failure, he drowned, and all that. But, anyone close to George, anyone in that orbit, knows what happened. Hell, you can watch the YouTube video. He ballooned up, on top of being a monster addict. His health was, on the downward slope for sure. But he will go down as one of the greatest songwriters to emerge from the 60s. Great voice, and was a master slide player. The Dixie, and dude, the thing about this too, Warner Brothers, for every one of these records, man, I mean, he had heavyweight backing. Every one of those records that George was on, Warner Brothers records. 1973, Dixie Chicken, Feats Don't Fail Me Now, My Last Record Album, Time Loves a Hero, as I had mentioned earlier, the Templeman, another Templeman production, produced record. Of course, Waiting on Columbus, and then the last record that Lowell was on was Down on the Farm. Now, we all know that the band got back together in 1987, did Let It Roll, phenomenal. They're still out there getting it done, and I think that's great, but it's not Little Feat. Stepping back, when you look at Little Feat, guys, and this is a mistake a lot of people made, I thought they were a Southern rock band. I mean, I missed the mark on these guys completely. I didn't even know about them, and I've been, an avid student of music since I was 7 years old. So somehow they missed my radar completely. Then when I finally got turned on to them, I'm like, these, Southern rock band. And, figured they were from Georgia or, Florida or Alabama or something. And no, they're a Southern California band, which explains a lot of that Southern California groove when you listen to, like, the Eagles. I can't tell you why, that, like, slow, laid-back, mellow vibe. And then you hear the same thing on, the tune On Your Way Down off of Dixie Chicken. So, Southern California dudes with that mellow Southern California vibe that's so hard to play. But, highlighted by so many great songs: Willin', Dixie Chicken, Apolitical Blues, Sailing Shoes, On Your Way Down, my personal favorite, Lafayette Railroad, Fat Man in the Bathtub. So, Little Feat, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. Check out some Little Feat. Check out some Palmer. Robert Palmer, that is. But you'll be pleasantly surprised if you aren't familiar with Sneakin' Sally Through the Alley and you're a Feat fan. Get a little extra Little Feat album that you didn't know about today, because you'll hear it. You'll definitely hear it in that record. So thanks for tuning in, guys. I appreciate the support. Hit the subscribe button and keep an eye out for our next episode of The Life and Times Rock Guitar History.